Right, welcome everyone to the Executive Member for Transport Decision Session, March 21st, 2023. Welcome everybody, and it's good to see at the end of the current administration so much interest in the transport projects that we've got progressing. First item I have on the agenda is declarations of interest. I have none that affect impartial decision making. I'm obviously very interested in terms of progression of the items before me today. The second item I have is the public speakers for public participation. And I would preface this section by saying, appreciate that we're coming close to local elections. But for the purposes of today, if we could try and focus on the decisions that are before me to make, I've slightly readjusted the order of speakers. So the first speaker I've agreed I would take Gwen Swinburne, just on because the item that she wants to talk about is governance matters, not all of which are on the agenda. So if you want Gwen to come first, and then Rachel will come after that. So welcome, Gwen.
I've written to you and Councillor Mason regarding Director Ferris misusing Highways Act 228, this time in Hull Road. But instead of a joint decision session today, he has bizarrely circumvented you and put it on Councillor Mason's decision session. You need to be involved. Next, I note in the active travel prioritisation of schemes, the most dangerous junction is Monkgate Roundabout, but instead of officers putting it as a priority 1, it is way down the priority list at priority 6. In order to protect your most vulnerable and highest priority users, please reverse this scheme immediately and reinstate the metal railings to protect pedestrians from vehicles. Likewise, officers' latest Monk Bar traffic light improvements means there's no assisted pedestrian crossing across Monkgate. Hundreds of students every day are being put at risk from multiple and growing numbers of student blocks. The danger zone is quite clear for everyone to see. They have no assistance. I mentioned at your last session the need to stop all these sharp-elbowed, undemocratic demands for LTNs and res parks until a proper strategy and policy is developed. I saw nothing in the minutes, so do I assume random sharp elbows will continue to be rewarded whilst others are in blissful ignorance of their democratic rights? Finally, I note that a truly magnificent road and culvert is in the final stages of completion at our expense on private land at Springfield Close. You will remember Mr. Ferris, excuse me, discreetly used his own delegations to throw, excuse me, £400,000, now no doubt more, on this private land. Now there is a glorious random piece of tarmac with no turning head, all on private land at our expense, well over £500,000, I expect. May I ask that the legal status of that piece of tarmac be clarified alongside a full report of the farce that got us here and costs. In particular, why the council staff did the work to cut down all the embankment trees, why the council dumped tons of tarmac that caused a further slip, why the landowners, adjoining properties and Frost Drainage Board were not charged. Who has responsibility now?
30 seconds.
I have it, thank you, Chair. Who has responsibility now for maintaining it? As Mr. Ferris assured us he wasn't going to adopt it, and officers didn't intend for this to be a precedent. Can you please have a full report, or should we go to scrutiny, Chair? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, which we'll take into account, particularly for the items that relate to what's on the agenda.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next speaker I have invited Councillor Melly, who I believe wants to speak a number of different items on the agenda. So she'll take you next.
Thank you. Good morning. On agenda item 3, Acomb Road safety update, After speaking about this at these decision sessions many times over the years, the scheme being repeatedly delayed, then almost scrapped completely, then shelved, I was relieved to see Acomb Road on the forward plan, completely pulling all of the funding for the scheme instead of doing whatever interventions were possible with available funding was an outrageous decision by the Liberal Democrat and Green executive. As ward councillors, we've consistently highlighted the dangers of this stretch of road and pushed for much needed walking and cycling safety improvements, only to be ignored. When I saw it on the agenda, I thought maybe you'd listened to the excellent campaign by local parents and children and decided to make changes, but I was so disappointed when I saw the actual report. The actions in the report aren't even the bare minimum that should be done and don't include any commitments to actual infrastructure changes. It isn't enough. You're putting children's safety at risk and undermining the work done by the local school teachers, parents, pupils and ward councillors to facilitate and encourage children to enjoy walking, cycling or scooting to school. Please take this issue seriously and take some meaningful action. On agenda item 4, active travel programme progress update. This is a regular agenda item, but it really should be renamed active travel programme lack of progress update. It's no wonder that cycling rates in the city are declining so drastically under your leadership and that Active Travel England have rated you at only 1 out of 4. The results of the consultation into the Riverside Path improvements show the level of need and strength of feeling about the much needed improvements to this path. There was a high number of responses and the results clearly demonstrate that all of the improvements are needed. Only delivering some is not acceptable. Improvements to lighting and CCTV to make the route safer are welcome, but of reduced benefit if the path is flooded and impassable anyway. It's not okay that you're ploughing ahead with the permanent closure of Lehman Road, but won't fully commit to funding and delivering all the necessary improvements to the only remaining direct route for pedestrians and cyclists. Agenda item 5, Hospital Fields Road. While there certainly are walking and cycling infrastructure improvements that could be made to this road, it seems like a strange priority for scarce active travel funding, while in the same decision session you're claiming there isn't funding available for essential improvements to Acomb Road or the Riverside Path or other schemes that score more highly than Hospital Fields Road in the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan priority system. And lastly, agenda item 6, digital residence parking. There are still so many problems with this system, many of which aren't acknowledged in this report's list of issues with the system. There's no mention of the extra pressure it is placing on enforcement officers or the impact on enforcement at service delivery. Recommendation 3 in the report says that non-digital customers can get paper permits, but I was contacted by a resident just a few days ago to say he'd been to the visitor centre to get a paper permit, but despite jumping through your administrative hoops, hadn't been able to adequately prove that he was non-digital and so was refused a paper permit. It's been a year and a half since the digital system was introduced, yet the executive member still hasn't made it work for residents. If Labour run the council after May's election, we will make sure the council is run better in terms of local people's daily lives, making the council more focused on people and customer service. This will include overhauling the digital Res Park system.
Thank you very much for those comments, which take into account those items on the agenda. The next speaker I have is Councillor Callum Taylor. On the Acomb Road and Riverside Path items. And as I appreciate that you may work independently, but if you could try and focus on different points as much as possible rather than just saying the same thing with speakers.
I'll give the speech as it's written, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Given their significance to Holgate, I'll be covering both the Riverside Path and Acomb Road. On the Riverside Path, when we as ward councillors raised this years ago, it wasn't on any decision-making radar, and I'm grateful for the work on it since that time to a point. The council's backing of the Lehman Road plans, leaving thousands without direct and always available access to their city centre, makes this scheme necessary. But there's nothing here to reassure that this project will ever be completed, let alone before Lehman Road closes, which it needs to be. Project costs have shot up to 2.3 million since this was first mooted. Less than 10% of that set to be spent here. For the rest, suddenly the council's thrown it onto the all too familiar Let's Hope Active Travel England pay for it pile. Your council is now relying on government to mitigate the harm you've actively left residents with, and the ask at 1.7 million is nearly 5 times bigger than the suggested funding allocation for all of York. Unless you know something we don't, then this bid will be laughed out of the park. We'll take the improved lighting and CCTV because this will still be a real improvement. But for the majority of the scheme that still needs doing, what happens when this government money doesn't come through? Not seeing this through is not an option, Councillor de Gorn. So what's your plan B? On Acomb Road, let's start with the positive. It's good to finally see some ink on paper looking at this issue, but that's about it. It's taken years of lobbying from ward councillors and the inevitable growth of a parent-led campaign for this council to only ever so slightly and seemingly reluctantly, possibly, maybe, perhaps one day nudge this issue forward. If this paper came after you were first pressed on this before the pandemic, it might have been passable, but it's taken over 3 years for 12 recommendations that are almost all either really vague, non-committal, or take undefined amount of time before being useful. The only recommendation which is specific is number 7, but that isn't even about Acomb Road. It's about Hamilton Drive. And that's on a report paid for by us as ward councillors with ward funding, not any decision that you've made centrally. We'll see if it's worth the money, and it best had be, because it should show the options and costings for a safe crossing point on that road, improve cycling provision, and making its junction with Holgate Road safer. And even that report is now 6 months late and counting. The paper on Acomb Road is a masterclass in how to use many words to say so little. And this is not a cheap dig, even if inside your heads you might be sat there being inclined to shrug my words off. I'd urge you to think again. This council needs a marker laying down. After May, after May, for our children's sakes, let's hope this Lib Dem Green Council's indifference for letting cars run wild around our schools and its relaxation with throwing limited resource at far less urgent causes in favourable parts of the city is brought to an end. Thank you.
A lot of support there. So the next speaker I have is Kate Revilius on the active travel programme, items 4 and 5.
Thank you. Last week, I came to your decision session because I wanted to celebrate and praise the excellent work that's been done to date on producing a draft LC Whip. This week, I'm back again because the recommended decisions on active travel schemes appear to ignore the strategic priorities identified by the LC Whip and instead put forward a hodgepodge of disjointed, unstrategic and timid interventions. Bootham Shipton Road A19 originally proposed segregated cycle infrastructure along its length, presumably with the objective of making it safer for cycling and increased levels of cycling. Now the recommendation in front of you is to spend a chunk of the funding that was awarded for the cycle scheme on a pedestrian crossing. Whilst the pedestrian crossing is much needed and will be a good thing, it will not meet the objectives of the original scheme to increase rates of cycling. This change of tack is unlikely to give Active Travel England confidence in the council's ability to manage its active travel schemes and further reduces the chances of ever installing cycling infrastructure along this route, now that there's even less money in that particular pot. Acomb Road, great that it's been recognised that this is one of the highest priority routes for upgrading active travel, but I'm perplexed as to why the council has put in a bid to the Active Travel England funding for nearly 3 million, when the guidelines the council has been told that their allocation for this round of funding is 367,000, with a maximum of just over 1 million for an ambitious scheme. If I'm being cynical, this looks like a bid designed to fail. Jubilee Terrace. This route will become increasingly vital as the York Central works progress, and yet the current recommendation is to improve the lighting along the route and wait for mythical funding to carry out path widening and flood prevention work. And finally, the whopping great anomaly of Hospital Fields Road, a route that doesn't appear on the 10 top priority routes identified in the draft LC Whip. Prioritising active travel here is like trying to ice a cake before you've even made the cake. The officer's report claims that the public consultation demonstrates support for cycle segregation along this route, and yet the consultation didn't ask people the question of whether they'd prefer the road to stay as it is. This is really poor consultation design and is disingenuous to use these results to suggest there's public support. One of the arguments put forward is that the current provision along Hospital Fields Road doesn't meet LTM 120 guidelines. Although this is true, it doesn't justify why this scheme should be prioritised over others. On that basis, almost anywhere on the cycle network in York could be chosen to throw money at. Furthermore, the proposed scheme doesn't even bring the cycle infrastructure on this road up to LTM 120 standards. The route westbound still contains critical fails. I'm confident that everything I've just said will be ignored, but nonetheless, I implore you to abandon the Hospital Fields Road scheme and instead request that the money is put towards one of the top 10 priority schemes identified in the LC Whip. And as I said last week, even if a scheme is too expensive to complete in one go, it's possible to break the scheme down into segments, cost up each segment, and prioritise the segments that currently present the greatest danger to cyclists. Thank you.
The next speaker I have is Lucy Steels Walshaw. Sorry. Yeah. Lucy Steels Walshaw is on the.
Thank you.
Call. Thank you. We can hear you now.
Okay. So, hello, I'm Lucy Steels Walshaw. I am Vice Chair of the Lehman Road Residents Association and a local resident who uses this route daily, as well as my family. And this is regarding the Riverside Path, Jubilee Terrace to Scarborough Bridge. As a resident of Lehman Road, we have a lot to thank the ward's local Labour councillors for, who've been pushing the council on this project for years. If they had not, then this project may not be where it is today. The route is yet largely enjoyable to travel along, but there are some serious flaws which have needed addressing for decades. While residents are grateful for the council finally looking at it and supporting us to get to the stage, everybody needs to remember that it's the closure of Lehman Road that has helped us get this on the agenda. The council, since day one, have backed the closure of that road and done little to ensure that the York Central Partnership, including the Railway Museum, leave residents with an improved travel offer when it happens. Regardless of any new roads provided on the York Central site, the Lehman Road community will no longer have a route to and from the city centre that's direct and always available. And as a result, delivering these improvements in full is critical. We do not want them to be merely aspirations, as the council report worryingly describes them. In terms of proposals, residents will absolutely welcome the improved lighting and CCTV along route. Above all, actual safety and perception of it's really important, and this will make a welcome improvement to the path. However, it's just one part of what's required, and residents are really worried that the council will leave us with just that. There seems to be no plan B for if the full 1.7 million bid to Active Travel England is not granted, and why something included in these papers to give the community confidence that the phases won't just disappear to a distant wish list. A phased approach is a logical one in most instances, but only if there's a budget and a plan for those phases. If only the first phase has one and none of the others, then it's just one smaller project. The council should be bending over backwards to deliver on this and not selling the community short with what looks like sudden reliance on the government to help mitigate some of the loss that their Lehman Road and York Central plans will create. Councillor de Gorn, what can you say to our community today to give confidence that there is a plan B if the Active Travel bid is not fully awarded? Will your administration plug the gap? And will the Railway Museum and York Central Partnership take responsibility for easing the consequences of actions outside the York Central site? If you cannot give a credible and positive answer to any of these questions, then given the situation you're in, administration have been happy to place our community in, then you should make way for representatives who will prioritise getting this job done properly over much less urgent schemes elsewhere. But if you can give a credible answer today, while it should have been in the paper, we really, really want to and need to hear it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. My next speaker I have is Mrs. Joanna Gawthorpe on Acomb Road. When you're ready.
Thank you. Statement from Tom Dennis, a teacher of 8 years at Acomb Primary, the school most affected by the unsafe conditions on Acomb Road. I'm in charge of maths and PE, one of the key stage leaders, and I'm also the active travel champion. Since 2015, we've worked with Sustrans active travel officers and saw a sustained decrease in car usage from 34 to 20%. These actions had a marked impact and saw national recognition. We received the prestigious Mode Shift Stars Gold Award, only the second in York and one of less than 100 schools at the time to be recognised in this way. We were awarded Active PE School of the Year in 2018 for York and North Yorkshire, primarily for our involvement in improving travel to school, and have been a finalist for this award for several consecutive years. We also regularly participate in the Big Walk and Wheel. This has seen us secure some incredible national finishes, regularly finishing top 5 schools in York and well within the top 100 nationally for the percentage of pupils commuting by foot, bike, or other sustainable means. This brings my statement to the concerning part. The issue that you're discussing today is not new, far from it. Safety improvements on both Acomb Road and Hamilton Drive are something that concerned members have campaigned about for 8 years. Although support from this council was initially high as they funded the sustenance programme, when this programme was cut some 3 years ago, support has ceased to be almost non-existent. Since that point, at every opportunity, the council has asked the school to take on more and more responsibility, often despite the accolades I listed showing the work we have done, asking the school, and often me personally, to do more. Decrease car usage and change driver behaviour, a school issue. Field complaints weekly about unsafe driving and parking, a school issue. Decrease idling across the city, a school issue. When asked about support for these areas, council members have offered little in the way of meaningful action or promise, instead asking me to take an ownership and direction of these elements. My introduction at the beginning of this statement was not a boast, but instead served to emphasize the already stretched responsibilities and roles teachers have. Now consider being told by a city council that I have to correct issues I have no legal power to enforce or correct, whilst completing a part of my role that I do voluntarily. When we have raised legitimate issues, such as replacing our crossing patrol officer or completing traffic surveys, elements under the direct jurisdiction of the council, elements that, unlike myself, someone is directly paid to complete, little action has been taken. When we raised the action already completed and the length of time we have campaigned, we were told that this was a new issue and we would have to join the back of the line. In fact, when it was put to the deputy leader of this council, Andy DeGorn, on a visit to review Acomb Road, that the council would not act until a member of the school community was struck and killed, he could offer little reassurance that this was not the case. Whilst I recognise that this conversation today is a step forward, I passionately believe that more needs to be done, and I strongly advocate you act. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very impressive statement. Next speaker I have is Mrs. Zena Chapman.
I'm a parent with a young child at Acomb Primary School. I'm here to respond to the recommendations in the paper, which has been presented to the executive as an update on the progress on road safety concerns identified on Acomb Road. Firstly, it's fair to say there has been no progress to report, and Acomb Road, along with Hamilton Drive, remain treacherous for pedestrians, particularly parents and children who are trying to access Acomb Primary School. As per the executive's modus operandi on these matters, the report is a paper of procrastination, recommending little of substance beyond collecting data, conducting reviews, and re-advertising a crossing patrol vacancy that's been unfilled for over 18 months and pays an hourly wage less than all local supermarket positions. It's unclear from the report how long we must wait for these substandard proposed initiatives to be undertaken. But given that feasibility studies proposed for Hamilton Drive in late 2021 are still yet to take place, I hold out little hope of this happening anytime soon. The justification of the council's position is that despite Acomb Road being classified over 2 years ago as a very high priority for road safety improvements and receiving £4 million of active travel funding, there is now no longer any money in the pot for our children's safety in this area. Meanwhile, £800,000 is proposed to be spent on improvements for Hospital Fields Road, a quiet cul-de-sac, and one of the very few parts of the city where I would be happy for my child to cycle directly on the road itself. Our campaign for safer crossing conditions around Acomb Primary School is well supported by the school community, including parents, teachers and local residents, and not a week goes by where we don't hear of near misses between children and cars on the road surrounding it. I appreciate it takes time, money and effort to make changes, and that the junctions, particularly on Acomb Road, are complex to re-engineer, but even our request for slower speed limits of 20 miles per hour as an emergency measure have been dismissed. If only the City of York Council were as good at slowing down roads as they are in slowing down the delivery of meaningful transport projects, our communities would be safer and happier places. Why our children should suffer with conditions and standards of road safety below that of roads around schools in other parts of the city, and the inability to prepare themselves for walking to secondary school remains unanswered. The apathetic response from this council to our concerns regarding child safety are alarming. It feels like the catalyst for change will only come once a child dies crossing the road trying to get to school. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I'll consider when we come to that item. Next speaker I have is David Finch on active travel on the Riverside route, I believe. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm speaking as the chairperson of the Friends of Leman Park. So the Riverside Path has a bizarre relationship with the York Central project. The need to improve the safety and dependability of the route has been discussed at every stage of consultation. However, the path has never made it officially into the York Central project scope. The upgrades were discussed in depth at the Stopping Up inquiry, and the route was clearly labelled as to be improved in the travel plan for the Railway Museum Central Hall. In his concluding writing up of the Stopping Up inquiry, the planning inspector, Paul Singleton, clearly placed the onus for the upgrades on York Council. Section 9.92, I quote, "There is currently no programme for the works, but the availability of funds should provide some confidence that the upgrading is likely to be carried out." Section 9.93, "The council should be able to carry out the upgrading work, but it is that in the council's control rather than the control of the applicant." And also in section 9.93, he wrote up, "The council should be encouraged to carry out the works before Leman Road is stopped up." He clearly used language that is non-binding, but conveyed a very clear message that there is a strong moral obligation on York Council. The stopping up was granted very much with this expectation in mind. So you'll surely appreciate it's a huge disappointment to our community that we are now discussing a watered down proposal, especially when you consider that we are now just months away from the stopping up. We have consistently made the case that the mitigation should precede the harm. We have only 2 viable active travel routes into town, and Leman Road is already secured alternative. Therefore, even though option 2 is a bitter disappointment, I can acknowledge the sense in delivering at least a small part of the safety benefits in time for the stopping up. But we need to see commitment from our council that the job will be finished. What if the active travel bid doesn't come to fruition? Councillor Dargon, I've spotted 4 inconsistencies with the bid, and I'm happy to explain those inconsistencies that I think officers need to explain if you want to question me. So yes, option 2 does seem to be appropriate to deliver at least some safety improvements swiftly, but I'd like to suggest an enhancement to this option. Option 4 proposes spending less than half the funds secured. By my reckoning, the rest of those funds could be used to deliver most of the secondary path in the western end, where compensatory flood storage shouldn't be necessary. This would still be beneficial, just incomplete. Indeed, in a high inflation economy, and with the stopping up expected so soon, it seems prudent to spend the committed funds as fully and as swiftly as possible to maximise the mitigation before the harm is done.
Thank you very much for those comments, which we'll consider when we come to that item. Obviously, officers may respond if they think that's appropriate at that point in time. Thank you. So the next speaker I have is Louise Woodruff, also on Acomb Road. And when you're ready for 3 minutes.
Good morning. I am a parent of a Year 5 pupil at Acomb Primary School, and I wish to comment on the Acomb Road safety update. So on the way to school, often the only way to cross is for vehicles to stop voluntarily on a 30-mile-an-hour road and wave children and parents across. And this includes unaccompanied children in Year 5 and Year 6 being waved across by drivers. There is no pedestrian crossing for 1 kilometre from the Fox Junction to the crossing near the Acomb Co-op. This is the reason that parents and residents have got together to ask City of York Council to take action. So my question when I read this report is, will my child and other children in the community be any safer? Sadly, while there is a long set of recommendations in the report, there is just no urgency or action plan or timetable or budget to make our children safer. So turning to some specifics in the report. Why does the council think that a crossing patrol person will be recruited if no one has come forward for nearly 2 years and the advertised rate of pay is lower than the starting salary of the major supermarkets? It just seems like a long shot. What is the plan if no one is recruited? How long is this going to go on? 1 year, 2 years? Will children go through the whole of primary school and there will still be no crossing patrol person? Acomb Primary School does not have those yellow-backed school warning signs like many of the other schools in York, including those in 20-mile-an-hour zones. Will these be installed at both sides of the school, and when will this happen? I understand from the paper that Acomb Road will be put on the speed limit review programme and welcome this development. Again, there is no timetable for decision making attached to this. And I welcome the speed assessments. However, we think that 20 is plenty. So even if average speeds are compliant with 30-mile-an-hour that we have on this road, that does not mean that 30-mile-an-hour is safe for this road. So many schools across the city have 20-mile-an-hour zones around them, precisely because of the risk of speed. So that is recognised as a safety measure elsewhere in the city, then it makes no logical sense that it would not be a safety measure for Acomb Primary. And as well as average speeds, the frequency of vehicles also needs to be taken into account, as it is the volume of traffic that also causes a problem, as there are a few gaps for pedestrians to be able to cross at peak times. I understand the difficulties of finding the correct location for a pedestrian crossing and that there are engineering challenges, but surely this makes the case for a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit around the school even more pertinent and urgent, whilst this challenge is overcome by design. The council may see this as a key distributed route, but we see it as our home and we want it to be a safer place to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. No, okay. I did have next was Councillor Kilbane, but I don't really believe he's here. So I'll move on to the next speaker I have is Lynette Mills, speaking on behalf of York Cycle Campaign.
Good morning, everyone.
When you're ready.
Thank you. I am presenting the statement on behalf of York Cycle Campaign. The campaign is deeply disheartened by the Council's sustained failure to deliver strategic improvements to active travel in York, as evidenced from today's meeting. As previously noted, the campaign believes that the Council has failed to make appropriate use of funding already allocated for active travel schemes. Money has been frittered away on feasibility studies and a handful of low-priority projects, while potentially transformative projects have been delayed and or watered down on dubious grounds. The campaign is concerned that the Council is still failing to think strategically and with a lack of ambition about the cycle network, and instead is tinkering around the edges. This will not deliver the scale of change needed to persuade people to move from cars to cycles. We hope that the LC work will result in a new approach, but as yet, there is no evidence of this. The campaign is also concerned that the Council is failing to make the case for active travel, for example, when conducting consultations. It is failing to draw on the expertise of Active Travel England and is deeply selective in its use of government guidance. Consequently, the Council's focus continues to be on finding problems rather than on delivering solutions that will address York's chronic transport problems. With regards to the schemes under consideration today, the campaign believes that whilst high-quality cycle infrastructure is needed throughout York, given the limited resources, priority should be given to projects where the need is greatest and the maximum benefit will be derived. Instead, the Council's approach is to target schemes that are easy or uncontroversial, but of limited value. We wish to highlight 4 particular schemes. Acomb Road. Acomb Road is a serious active travel failure. It's a key route, but unsafe for cyclists and for pedestrians, including the children and parents of the local primary school. This area should be of utmost priority for both pedestrian and cycling improvements, but this is not happening. A19 Shipton Road. Like Acomb Road, the A19 Shipton Road is a serious active travel failure. If the Council had acted decisively, as other councils did, a transformative cycle scheme could already be in place. Instead, the excuses and delays continue. The Riverside Path. The project to upgrade the Riverside Path will fail to deliver significant benefits unless the work includes the path widening and flood resilience elements which appear likely to be postponed. And finally, Hospital Fields Road. The council's floor consultation indicates that Hospital Fields Road does not present a major barrier to cycling, and the proposed scheme will deliver limited improvements to a road that was not identified as a priority in the draft LC whip. We believe that the money would be better spent on cycling schemes where the need is greater, such as those mentioned previously. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, which we'll consider when we come to that item. That concludes the public speakers list we have today. So on that basis, I'll then move on to the next item on the agenda. Acomb Road safety update on pages 1 to 16 in the report. So I'd like to firstly, I would like to say very much thank officers for their work on this, and also the residents for their input when we made that site visit just before Christmas to see firsthand the issues that you're facing, and I very much do appreciate the comments that you've made in the public contributions, which hopefully officers will take account in their response.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Chair. I'll just
Introduce who you are. So.
Oh, sorry, Dave Atkinson. I'm the Head of Highways and Transport at Exeter York Council. I'm accompanied today by Jane Ward, who's one of our road safety experts. Who will be fielding some of the questions. I might bring Jane in for some of the questions when we get to that point. But has been working actively with the school on the school crossing patrol recruitment. I think probably first up, what's initiated this report was a site visit we had with residents in December, and we also received, thank you for the representations from residents and ward councillors separately, and I hope some of the points in my first response to the ward councillor are clarified in those exchanges. Road safety is something that the council takes very seriously, and we'll always review and make sure that we implement appropriate and proportionate measures, balancing the priorities across the whole city and the funding we have across the whole city. But what I'll do is I'll drop straight into the detail and recommendations of the report, if that's okay. And if I go through those, then I could maybe offer some insight into timings and things like that that aren't necessarily in the content of the report.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think probably a side item, but not critical, is I'm aware that there's some petitions that have been completed. So I had to write this report without the petitions being there, even though it would have initiated the report. But I thought it was probably sensible to expedite the report rather than wait for the petition. But my understanding is there's a significant number of signatures on Hamilton Drive one and an Acomb Road one. So Councillor Taylor spoke about the scope, and he spoke about this being an Acomb Road report, although there are references to Hamilton Drive. When we did the site visit, which, just for clarity of anyone watching, it was attended by myself, Councillor De Gorman, and at the end of the visit by one of the members of the communities team. The concerns were raised about both Acomb Road and Hamilton Drive. The title of the report ended up being Acomb Road, just as a cover-all until we got through the petitions. But having had the representations, I think it's clear where we are. So just walking through the recommendations. So I think the principal observation on site was an increase in pedestrian movement around about the school dropping off point. So it was in the morning that we did the site visit. So I'll talk about the school drop off rather than pick up. So we've put some additional effort behind that recruitment campaign. It has been a challenge. It's been a challenge getting interested candidates in that. And moving on to recommendation 2, one of the things that we're going to look at is reviewing the job description, terms and conditions with HR to see if we can do anything with that in terms of re-evaluation. Jane, I don't know if you want to say anything on that.
I'm not sure, sorry. But I also work managing the school crossing patrol service, which I've done for 15 years. So I can assure you your concerns are absolutely in my heart. I've seen quite a few of you before. So we have been working with the school and the Mormon Church has very kindly let us put a big banner up the summer. My colleague Neil Thompson, who's the supervisor, has been distributing leaflets, flyers all through Acomb and the libraries, various points of contact, various support groups. Unfortunately, we haven't had any interest in that. You know, since Malcolm left 2 years ago, I have not won a phone call. A lot of people complaining, granted, and I take those on board, but no input parties. I'm going to try and work with Kate to see if we can make the job more appealing. The hourly rate has gone up to £10.20 now. I'm looking maybe to try and make it more appealing to give extra time for the walkthrough to get your uniform and stuff back to sites. But that's something we'll want to talk to Kate about. But the campaign is still ongoing. Like, we never stop campaigning, but historically, across the city, we've got another 10 vacancies without interest. So that campaign, like you say, it goes on and on and on. We just need somebody who will step forward and do the role.
Could I ask a question at this stage? Would it be sort of from on site?
Sorry, we're not sort of allowed to do that procedurally, but I mean, I'll be quite happy when listening to that. Yeah, sorry for that, but not procedurally, but otherwise we won't get through the business. But certainly for our questions after the meeting, by all means, either email or telephone to follow that up. One question I have, if I could ask that, is I'm sure that from an HR perspective, generally the City of York Council does encourage job sharing. I don't know, is that something which has been considered?
That's mentioned on the correspondence that goes out that is suitable for job share of any age.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked that is because I appreciate, you know, as you said, it's an hourly rate for a very small amount of time each day. But if, as you know, job sharers have a greater flexibility to be able to cover for each other if they've got an appointment or other things like that. You know, in a normal workplace, job sharers work quite closely with each other in terms of their time, and that might be make it something that somebody would be perhaps willing to consider.
With comms on revamping the whole recruitment, some different materials. So
and secondly, I would just say that unfortunately, legally, the council is not required to provide crossing patrols, and it's certainly every year it comes up as a possible budget saving, and I'm always one of those who are opposing that.
Thank you.
You know, because I think it's so critical in terms of promoting active travel and making and safety around our schools. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Just wanted to make it clear as well, that was something that officers had recommended as a short-term and sort of longer-term thing. This didn't come forward from the from the residents, but it was something that we observed when we were on site. Recommendation 3. So if we move on to this sort of speed limit and crossing issues, recommendation 3 is around the review of policy pedestrian crossings to bring to a future exec member decision session, which should obviously be in the next administration, which is why we can't put a time scale on that. One of the reasons, and it's explained in the report, one of the reasons that we felt was a necessity to change is we quite often get challenged on suppressed demand. So basically, we would take it's all an evidence-based approach. We would take the evidence as it comes forward, but there are some other factors that we want to put in there just to make sure that our response in terms of getting something installed is proportionate. And we do have a budget. We talked about the balancing budgets. We do have a budget for pedestrian crossing scheme, so that's something that we have on the programme. So we'll do that. Recommendation 3 will happen once we engage with the next sorry, James.
I think just to clarify, one of the public speakers talked about volume of traffic and those sorts of issues, and that piece of work around recommendation 3 is absolutely doing that piece of work. So that's part of that rationale.
So just to be clear, that's saying that in policy terms, we maybe need to review the existing policy. You know, so we obviously need to be equitable across the whole city in terms of how we approach the issue, but there may be some changes that we can make to improve
Yes,
that.
so I think what recommendation 3 is saying is we've got an existing policy which follows a piece of DFT guidance from a fair while ago, in fairness, about the volume of traffic and volume of pedestrians and how that works. And I think what recommendation 3 is saying is we'll review the policy as well as collecting the data.
I'll move on to recommendations 4 and 5, which are, well, 4, 5 and 6, which are linked to the speed limit issue, which residents raised. So the first one would be to commission some immediate activity, looking at the compliance to the current limit. I think there was representations about a speed limit reduction rather than actually being speeding. But when we did the site visit, some residents also felt there was not compliance to the 30-mile-an-hour limit that was already in place. So that's recommendation 4. So that'll be with immediate effect. Recommendation 5 is to put the limit on Acomb Road onto the speed limit programme, which I think will probably be due around about June or July. So it'll be in the summer. We do we used to do an annual programme of speed limit review, but we've tended to treat it in a bit more of a flexible manner in the last sort of 18 months. So that'll happen.
Just on that particular one, I'm having fairly recently dealt with an item on one of these meetings about speed limits. And the speed management program that we have with the partnership has a process for assessing what the 85th percentile and the mean and so forth. Do we have any recent data from there, and if not, can we actually do that before July so that we've got some information to inform that?
There hasn't been any recent data collected because we haven't had any concerns.
Right.
So if yourself or somebody wanted to put a new speed concern in via North Yorkshire Police online, then of course data will be collected over a week to 10 days and go through the system. But we need somebody to actually kick that off.
Probably that's one for the residents and will councillors possibly to identify the locations which are most of concern. I know from past experience of myself as a ward councillor that the approach is basically to outside number 10 or whatever it is, and that's where they do the speed survey. So if you highlight where the concern lies in the actual submission, and then that will be a week assessment, and ideally, obviously, in the circumstances, it would be more appropriate to do it during the school term rather than in the holidays period. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And then, so that covers recommendation 4 and 5. And then recommendation 6 is just to make sure that this issue is picked up when we move forward with the Acomb Road Active Travel Scheme. Recommendations 7 and 8 are around Hamilton Drive. So there are 2 schemes that we've currently got ongoing. So these are currently being worked on by officers. These aren't things these will happen in the 23-24 Transport Capital Programme. One of them is to improve conditions for cyclists along the stretch of Hamilton Drive, and the other one is a safer routes to school scheme, which is the Catholic school, which I forget the name of the top of my head.
Our Lady's Green Martyrs.
Our Lady's Green Martyrs, that's right. So those are 2 schemes that will be done in the next.
So just clarify, those are ward schemes that they're committed to progress.
So one of them's a ward scheme, which is committed to progress. That's the cycling scheme. The other one is part of our safety programme, which sits on the Transport Capital Programme.
Okay, and any indication of when that might be moving forward to construction? Because we've got feasibility is already complete, isn't it? And
yes,
I have a detailed design.
I haven't got indication of those timings, but again, because of we've brought some of this stuff.
Okay.
Forward,
I appreciate it has to fit into the citywide programme of works, but obviously any works close to schools, we want to ideally try and deliver on the ground in the school holidays rather than in the midst of a term period. But
recommendation 8 is, I mean, it's quite a funny one. I think we'd through separate schemes that have been created a small stretch of 30-mile-an-hour limit that remained on Hamilton Drive. So I'm going to ask that gets addressed, because I think it's just a case of closing that gap. I think we both observed that on site. So again, that'll come through the summer on the speed limit programme. And then recommendation 9 is exploring exploring the possibilities around crossing improvements on Acomb Road, which we've started doing the work for, but as I think some of the public speakers represented, it is quite a complex arrangement of junctions, and also because of the bus stop being so close on the northern side of Acomb Road, it is quite complicated. I spoke to ward councillors about potentially using some ward funding on temporary measures, but again, we just need to follow through with some work to see what we can do in that area. So that again is something that we're looking at.
I mean, I think on that one, I would sort of really urge. We know what the need is. There's a need for a pedestrian crossing as close as possible on the desire line for people accessing the school. So if it means that the scope means we should look at whether the bus stop needs to be moved a little bit, or in a right turn ban, which is the next item, those are sort of should obviously be in scope as to what we look at to try and work out how we can provide that crossing.
And then, sorry, recommendation 10 is then linked to that, which would be to look at the right turn out of Grantham Drive, which we would need to do the modelling on to determine the impact across that particular area. Recommendation 11 was, again, we'll add this to the lining programme for 23-24, but there was a gap in the double yellow line between a small stretch where there were a couple of cars parked on West Bank, which is one of the tributary roads to Acomb Road, which leads through to Acomb Primary School. So there's some questions around.
So on that one, can I just clarify? It says the breaking WL lines. I'm not clear from that whether there was a mistake in terms of marking what the TRO, or whether we need a TRO to actually implement that change.
No, it was the gap was left to provision parking for the flats.
Okay. So the question from that is, I'm happy to amend that recommendation to say that we progress the legal process of advertising the TRO. So that that's not holding things up. So no, we don't need to defer that to another decision. I'm happy for that to be part of this decision, to be minuted, that we advertise the traffic regulation order to fill that gap, and then the consultation process can continue.
And are you happy if there's no objections that I can just make that under delegation?
Yeah, fine with that.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. And then the final one was around just improving, taking immediate action to improve signage in the area. So there's a number of options around there. I think there was one around the gateway to Moorgate and weight limits, and there were things around reducing the height of the school signs. We looked at the wigwags, which were working, weren't they? So there is compliant signage, but we've got some recommendations from.
Just to clarify, you mentioned the wigwag is a flashing amber sign to alert the fact that there's a school approach, presumably there on either end of the approach on Acomb Road. Is that
either side? Yes. And they are on school times.
So they are
working.
in place.
They've been checked.
Thanks. just on the issue about the right turn out of Grantham Drive, I appreciate that there may need to be some survey work done to look at the and modelling work to look at the impact, particularly on Car Lane, which is the alternative route that people may take parallel to Grantham Drive, but also New Lane, because I think if vehicles that are currently turning left to then progress further south may turning right, or instead would turn left. That may then go through New Lane, so which obviously impacts on school routes that people are taking. So we need to look at that as well.
Yeah, and that will form part of the scope of the modelling work. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that will be looked at as part of that piece of work. So I think, does that cover
that? Covers all
the recommendations. Okay. I mean, on that basis, I appreciate what the residents say. So what parents in particular have said about, and the teacher have said about the situation there, and I think it certainly is worthy of commendation, the effort that a particular teacher has put in over the years. Certainly, without those sorts of champions in schools, we wouldn't have the work that we're doing already underway. And I do appreciate that, as I said, from reference to a comment made earlier on, you are the vocal people speaking up for your children, your community, which is to be valued, but we do need to try and make sure that we have that balance and consider those that perhaps less vocal, and make sure that we are being equitable in what limited resources we have, whether it's staff or funding. And try to make sure that we do also respond. I always am very reluctant to sort of advocate looking at accident statistics, because there's a lot of people who may choose not to use a particular route because it's too dangerous. But nevertheless, we do have to recognise that a priority has to go towards anywhere that has already got an accident record. We don't want to wait until that happens, and we want to be more preventative about the approach that we take.
I think I was just going to add, Councillor de Gaunt, that obviously, should a petition be received, they normally get reported to these. Well, they do get reported to these decision sessions. So, if a petition is received, we will obviously update on our progress against those actions when we bring that petition to your decision session, as well as address anything that's new or not being considered in it, obviously.
So, at that point, I'd like to thank everyone for the contribution on that item, and support the recommendations with that slight amendment to that recommendation about the traffic regulation order. So that then moves me on to page 17 and the active travel programme update. So on this one, I'd invite officers to introduce the programme and provide an update on how we're taking forward this ambitious programme of active travel schemes, notwithstanding the challenges that we have in terms of funding, and in particular, there's still awaited decision on our tranche 4 funding bid, which is referenced in the papers. I think it needs to be noted that selection of suitable projects was a challenge in terms of what we put forward, trying to balance the ambition against the funding focus we were told from the DFT on construction ready schemes, which already have gone through a detailed design process. I think that was the intention of this bid which we put forward, but we're still awaiting the outcome for that. So I'll hand over to officers to take me through.
Just very quickly, as by way of an introduction, this obviously follows on and is an update for your session. But the decision about priorities was made at executive last year. So in terms of the priorities of the existing programme, that was determined by the executive as a whole last year, and that was where the Monkgate decision was made. The development of the schemes for tranche 4, as you know, was made in conjunction with members of the executive from all sides in terms of the priorities that were submitted. And just to confirm, as I know everyone's asked me, we still haven't got allocations on active travel tranche 4, which were due to be announced last week, I think. And also just to confirm, we have had a letter from Active Travel England confirming that their funding is affected by the announcement made in both houses on the 9th of March about a reduction in funding to Department for Transport generally. So there will be less active travel funding in the longer term than perhaps they'd originally anticipated. I'll hand over to Christian.
Good afternoon. I'm Christian Woods, Transport Programme Manager within the Council. The report that's in front of you basically has 4 items within it. I'll briefly summarise each of the items and my colleague Tony Clark will summarise the 4th item. Firstly, there is an update, a general update on the active travel programme because the active travel programme itself contains 24 individual projects. I haven't contained within the report itself a lot of detail, but you can refer to Annex C to see the general status of each individual project. Within the report, I've also highlighted some key points on some schemes that I know have got particular interest. For example, Weldrake and Heslington. I can confirm that we've completed the actions of the November executive report with regards to that scheme, and we've made contact with landowners and are starting to get some responses through. We'll continue to engage in discussions with those landowners. I've also highlighted the A19 corridor scheme. Again, in November, this scheme was split into 2 phases. The overall corridor scheme is on pause pending further funding. However, the first phase interventions is within this report, and I'll get onto that in item 3.
Just one particular point. I think it's worth stressing that, as you say, reference to the November executive member decision identified that we had something like 36, from memory, was it 36 million pounds worth of programme potential, which when we first started on the active travel funding, because we hadn't had the detailed sort of feasibility work done, we had no real indication of the actual scale of what we're putting forward. So the decision in November was very much to try and manage that whole programme and to move forward as quickly as possible on those that we could have, came within the budget of what we got available. So that's a lot of what's the basis for this decision on this paper, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. The programme was rationalised in November to provide increased assurance that the phase 1 schemes can be physically delivered on the ground. There are 2 decisions within this paper that you'll be asked to make, and the first is the 3rd item within the paper, which relates to the project outline for phase 1 interventions on the A19 scheme. The project outline, it gives a description of what the expectations are for that project. It's basically a pedestrian crossing to increase access for pedestrians trying to cross A19. I won't go into that into too much detail unless you have specific questions, but again, a consultation with local ward councillors was carried out. And the recommendation within the paper is to approve the project outline that describes that scheme. The other item within this report that has a recommendation and requires a decision is item 4 that relates to the Riverside Path. Sorry, I've not mentioned the funding bid item yet. I'll come to that in a second. The second item in the report summarises the funding bid that we submitted to Active Travel England. It gives a little bit of background on the timescales we were working to and the rationale on which schemes we included within that bid. Annex D also gives a little bit more detail on that if anybody's interested on the outcome. But to summarise very briefly the rationale as to how we came up with the schemes that we were submitted. The primary consideration was that this bid, Active Travel England are looking to give funding for schemes that are ready for construction. So when we're talking about the LC WIP and the draft schemes within the LC WIP, many of those are at a very early stage and they require development and feasibility work. We therefore prioritise schemes that are further along in the process. Similarly, we obviously took into account the specific eligibility criteria within the grant bid letter itself and additional guidance from Active Travel England. We have engaged with Active Travel England regularly throughout the bidding process. They were very helpful in carrying out briefing sessions that we attended and took some very helpful advice from. I'll pass on to...
Just before we pass on, maybe if I can just comment on the A19 scheme as you referred to, option 1 there does leave it open in terms of the precise location in relation to the junction, I believe, is that? So that would be subject to further work looking at, because I believe the consultation responses did say there were some, or in the report there's reference to some benefits, whether it's slightly further north or south of the junction. But that would be looked at as part of developing and bringing forward that particular scheme. Is that?
Yeah, in simple terms, the pedestrian crossing can either go to the north or the south of the junction. There are likely to be pros and cons of each approach. During the consultation with the local ward councillors, we have already received some feedback on what the residents would prefer, and that will absolutely be taken into account during the design process. This isn't a decision for you to approve the installation of the scheme itself. As I say, the feasibility work hasn't yet been completed. Okay. This is a decision to agree what the scheme will actually be, and it could be either to the north or the south at this point. Okay. So item 4 relates to the Riverside Path, and I think it's the item that's had the most interest from the public speakers. There is a decision to make on this item, and I'll pass over to Tony to cover this one.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Tony Clark. I'm the York Central Highway Authority lead. I've been working on the Riverside Path for some time. So we commissioned a consultant end of last year, to undertake some initial feasibility on options for widening the path, looking at a separate new path, raising the level potentially, CCTV and lighting upgrades. Following that, we undertook consultation in December and January, just to understand the key objectives of the community for the area, priorities for the improvement, and allow comments on some of the indicative concept ideas that came out of the initial feasibility. We had over 400 responses, and there's a report in Annex F collating those responses. But in principle, the highest priorities that came out from that consultation was improvements to lighting, raising the path, and also widening the path to increase capacity. The key outcomes of the feasibility just identified really the high cost of undertaking some of those elements, particularly the raising the path and the widening the path, owing to the lengths involved. There's also levels of uncertainty on those cost estimates which we've been put forward. So the full scheme, the indicative cost is about £2.3 million. But of that, there's quite a lot of items which we haven't got full certainty of. And the key one for that is the flooding, the impact on flooding. Obviously, if we raise the path over length to reduce the impact of flooding on people using the path, there is potentially a need for flood compensation requirements, and that can be expensive. So we propose to do additional work on that. And also the impact on trees, the location of the trees along the path mean that widening would have a potential impact on the roots of the trees. So there's an uncertainty on the level of cost to address that. So the recommended option, what I should probably just say is obviously the speakers that came forward, generally it appeared that there was support for a phased approach for delivery of the scheme, but there were obviously key concerns about the widening and raising and the timing of that to be undertaken due to those funding constraints. We will look at those items, and I think one of the key issues is to make sure that we have got realistic cost estimates for those elements. So the recommended option is option 2, is to deliver the scheme on a phased basis, progressing the higher priority improvements in phase 1 that can be afforded within the budget available, and developing further phases, so developing the work that we need to undertake to address those uncertainties for delivery when funding is identified.
I was just going to add to that very last point Tony made. So obviously we've got a funding bid in to make up a substantial part of the difference at the moment as part of tranche 4. Obviously, if that is not successful, as some speakers have said, of course, is a possibility, then obviously we'll bring that to a future decision session or executive to consider whether and how that funding gap will be met, and that will be obviously for a new administration to determine.
Yes, thank you on that. I mean, I do acknowledge the sort of outcome of the consultation did highlight, you know, the fact that there's a range of measures that are needed for a holistic approach. Can you just clarify for me, there was reference to the stopping up order and the closure of the route through Lehman Road, because I think that is obviously going to be a big concern for residents about how our timing for this might fit with that. And I'm also right, if I'm right in remembering that the commitment for the stopping up is that there will be an alternative cycling and walking route before that sort of measure is put in place. Do we have any indication of what the timescale is for that to happen?
Yeah, so in terms of the stopping up order, the conditions on that being progressed is the provision of alternative routes. So that's for vehicles, but also a cycle route and a walking route around the stopped up area. And obviously for pedestrians through the National Rail Museum during opening hours with a walkways agreement in place. So
obviously that won't be what during the construction period while the building.
No, but the provision of the alternative route will be available. So the cycling and walking route around the National Rail Museum is part of the condition, and that has to be in place before the stopping up can be implemented. So the timing of that does have to be in place.
But what is the timing projected at the moment? I know construction schemes, obviously, it can vary depending on the weather and other factors. But do we have any? You know, is it 6 months, 18 months, or
the program date?
To happen?
The program date for implementation of the stopping up is November this year currently. Obviously you're quite right, there's quite a lot to undertake before that, but as I say, it is conditional. So that work has to be complete before the Highway Authority will accept that to be implemented.
So obviously that, you know, if that has already started, then that has implications for particularly work near a river. We're not going to be doing it in the winter time anyhow, are we? Because of the risk of flooding during the work. So of the recommendation here would allow us to progress the lighting and CCTV work, in the next prior to that particular point, wouldn't it?
That would be the aim. We do need to do the detailed work on those items. And there are certain permissions that we would need to get, particularly for the CCTV element, to progress those items. So we need to work through that detail. But the aim would be to get it in place before the stopping up was implemented.
Okay. And the other question I had was that assuming you have at least some idea of the level that you would want to raise the ground to, if at some point we get funding for that, I assume that would be taken into account in terms of positioning of lighting columns, if we're putting in new lighting columns or replacing existing ones, because obviously we need to take that into account in terms of the positioning of them.
Yes, we'll look at that to try and future-proof any provision of lighting to take account of that. But there may be some abortive work by undertaking it upfront in advance of the main scheme coming forward.
And would this costing include, I mean, a key element of lighting, I think, is underneath Scarborough Bridge. I mean, presumably that would have to be negotiated with Network Rail, but I think that would be from a personal safety point of view, something that we'd need to be included within any lighting scheme.
The lighting improvement would include that subway element.
Okay, thank you. And again, at that particular location, it would give us the opportunity to review signing and a barrier there. I mean, we've got a programme across the city, I know, of reviewing all the barriers on cycle routes. So one would hope that that can be a priority to take forward, because I believe last time I went down there, there was sign in one direction telling cyclists to dismount, and there's nothing coming the other way. So not quite sure how the person coming the other way is supposed to know, unless they happen to come that way before earlier in the day.
I understand that the signs do tend to go missing, so we try and keep on top of that. In terms of the barriers have been changed at the Jubilee Terrace end, so they are more accessible than they were.
Yes, I'm aware.
And we will look at the barriers at the Scarborough Bridge end as well. As I say, there would be some need to raise the path slightly in that area. So again, we'd have to be careful that we weren't doing any abortive work.
Okay, so I mean, that's not necessarily specified in the report, but obviously if we can make sure that we look at those issues and any other issues, like you said, the impact on trees, well, obviously if that work to assess what's needed can be progressed, so that as and when we get funding for the raising work, we've sort of got more detail on what might be needed, the impact on the design.
Yes, we can undertake that.
So I think that covers the main points on that, unless you've got anything else, Tony, you need to cover with this.
No, I think that's it. Thank you.
Right.
Well, quickly come back in, we covered all items from your perspective as well, just to double check.
I think, well, unless
I've got one or two other points actually. Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of, quite apart from the things and items that have been asked to make a decision on, there was a reference to Monk Bar roundabout, which it is Monk Gate. Get it right, Monk Gate roundabout, and that was on the list of identified accident clusters for some further work if we were to secure funding from Active Travel England. That was on our long list that was submitted for possible funding, I believe, wasn't it? So if it's given there's been some comments, I don't know if you want to comment on what we do if we don't get that funding.
So the bid we put to Active Travel England was in two parts. It was schemes that we are asking for funding to construct and take to delivery, and there was a second part which was schemes that we were asking for funding to start the development and the feasibility work for. And Monkgate roundabout was in that development pot. So we have requested money to do the feasibility work.
I mean, I am conscious that this did score very highly, I think, on the LC whip work, which is obviously still progressing and won't be signed off and complete until the summer. But I think, given the conflict between cyclists on roundabouts is never a good mix, and the alternatives of there are at best a poor compromise. There is some major work that we need to try and look at going forward on that, as and when we can get some funding to address it as part of a strategic route.
And I think, just to clarify, Active Travel England, and Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, asked us to split our bids up between those that are ready to deliver and those that needed design development work. Monkgate needs design development work, which is why it's in that category.
The other one I was going to just comment on was there is some reference to the north-south city centre cycle route, which is otherwise known as the Way of the Roses, has been identified as part of a long distance route for many years. And that does very much linked to the navigation road scheme, was the first phase of that particular route. But unfortunately, we still seem to be awaiting a detailed design from that. And I think that does sort of is fairly critical in the sense of all the other measures we're looking at around the city centre. This one hopefully will progress as quickly as possible. And there's also a section of the navigation road scheme which was never implemented. I'm not clear whether that's still on the books or has been abandoned now. But
so with regards to the city centre north-south cycle route scheme, in November, the decision was made to prioritise that scheme in phase 1 and to award the contract to undertake the feasibility work. Okay. That contract has been awarded. The consultant has started the feasibility and design work. Coincidentally, I met with them yesterday as they started to produce their first outputs of that. So I can say that work is continuing. Mm-hmm. When the feasibility work has been completed, the next stages will be, as per the other schemes, we'll undertake a consultation, we'll come for a decision and progress in that manner.
Okay, so I welcome the fact that that's moving forward. But as I said, the other part of it was there was an element of the navigation road scheme, which was to address some conflict issues on the corner of the route that leads on to Foss Islands Road. I don't know if you're familiar with that scheme. There was some changes that were proposed there and approved, but
I believe my colleague might have some information about this one. Is this, sorry, Ben Potter saying?
Yeah, the road safety scheme. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a separate scheme to the east-west, which is being addressed in a different road safety program. Right. So the road safety team is progressing that.
So it's still there. Yeah. It's sort of flagging that up as another element. And lastly, one other key link we're still waiting. I have been chasing it, but is the Scarborough Bridge route through to Bootham Park. We've got the crossing over Bootham now, signalised crossing at the end of St Mary's. There is just the ramp up from Marygate Car Park now, which I believe is still awaiting some utility works that are holding it up. But you know, that is the missing link in the route from the station to the hospital, which is quite critical at the moment in time when we look at trying to promote active travel to the hospital and reduce the congestion there. So if there's any news on that.
Yeah, again, apologies, that's part of a different programme. I haven't prepared an update on those schemes. I don't know if any of my colleagues have any information to hand. I can get that to you after the session if you'd like. Okay.
I'll say I did follow it up recently. We have made some progress in that through negotiation with the hospital, the gates into Bootham Park now are open during the week, during the working week at least. Which is progress in terms of that being a functional active travel route. So those were sort of some of the general points about other things are not down for decision. In terms of the decisions, I'm happy to approve the A19 phase 1 project outline, noting, as has been said, it's not a cycling measure, but it will, I feel, play a valuable role encouraging walking and cycling in the area by introducing signalised crossing over the busy A19 Shipson Road. And certainly when we get to the point of that implementing that full active travel corridor, it will help with the speed issues which we've discussed there, and the intention to reduce the speed limit for part of Shipton Road down to 30 miles an hour, having the traffic flow interrupted by pedestrian crossing will help to change that character into a more urban environment rather than a sort of fast road into the city centre. So I think that will help, and I'm sure some of the local drivers would probably welcome interruptions in traffic flow to get in and out of side roads along Shipton Road as well. So I'm happy with that one. And then the other one was the proposal, as we've discussed, for the riverside lighting and the prioritising CCTV and lighting, with the additional comments that I've made about just exploring any improvements we can make in the short term to do with things like the barriers at the Scarborough Bridge end and any sort of assessment of the flooding and trees issues, so that we can progress that as soon as we got funding available to progress the widening and floodproofing the route. I appreciate it's not, when I say floodproofing, it will reduce the number of days a year when it's out of action, which you know, it's not going to say we can't, with climate change, certainly can't guarantee that it will be floodproof all the time, but certainly increase the number of times in a year when people are able to use that as an off-road route into a city centre. So that concludes that item. So I'll move on now to. Sorry, yes, certainly, sure. So I'm just going to take a short break. Now, appreciate that people may need, if I'd say about 4 or 5 minutes. Is that okay with people? So welcome back, and moving on to item 5, Hospital Fields Road Active Travel Scheme. Right. Firstly, I think we need to note the comments from speakers and invite officers to outline the options and merits of each one, and also just if there's any particular points you want to make in response to consultation the comments from speakers.
Hi, Shoaib Mahmood, Project Manager for Hospital Fields Road. So the Hospital Fields Road is an active travel scheme, provides segregated cycle facilities on Hospital Fields Road. It forms a part of the east-west link, so it's a strategic route. So in the exec report, we've got 4 options which have been proposed. The 4 options are: you got light segregation, which is Scheme 1, Scheme 2 is curb segregation, Scheme 3 step track segregation, and Scheme 4 footway level demarcated cycle lane. These 4 schemes went to public consultation. Feedback was sought on these schemes from the public and stakeholders. So within the report, we've summarised the key themes that appeared within the consultation, such as loss of parking, scheme not required, loss of road space, footpath widths, and comments in support of the scheme. A few of the representation made today was regarding the scheme not required / being a top priority scheme. The scheme was actually approved in the November 22 executive. So on that basis, officers are proceeding with the scheme. And obviously we've got resource allocated to deliver the scheme, so design is in place. Within the exec report, there's analysis of the costs, the pros and cons of each scheme, which I can go into detail if you require, and a cycle level of service based on LTN 120 guidance was done by the consultants. We are seeking 3 decisions today to select which. First decision is to select which proposed scheme to take forward to detailed design and construction. So the schemes that we've presented are preliminary schemes. So the designer needs to obviously do a more detailed design of these schemes. We're seeking approval to advertise amendments to traffic regulation orders through introduction of no waiting restrictions, and seeking approval to delegate authority to Director of Transport, Environmental and Planning to approve the design when the detailed design is done. There is sufficient budget. This is a scheme which is funded through capital funding. So there is sufficient budget and which has been approved to deliver the scheme.
Thank you. Just to answer that point on the funding, I believe this scheme was actually put onto the programme list from memory in 2019, and then was formally approved by the director during the first lockdown period. That's how it came to be on the programme. So it predates the actual Active Travel England funding that we've been bidding for on a separate process. And as you've referred to in paragraph 52 of the report, it is an important, I think it's a part of the Sustrans route. It's part of an east-west cycle route linking, which is already well used, linking between the off-road paths around Millennium Bridge through to the university campus. So, it obviously has a lot of people who use it, but unfortunately it is also an industrial estate. One of the bus depots has now moved out of there prior to housing development on the site, but nevertheless, it is still used quite significant amount of local traffic. So I think the proposal to do something is still relevant and has, as you've said, gone through a number of stages already to reach this point. So the issues about Acomb Road, were funding through a different funding route, and unfortunately, as we've said, there's a lot more demand from our programme than we've got funding overall. I just wanted to ask a few questions that relate to some of the consultation responses. I think it would be helpful. A lot of people, quite understandably, asked why there's only segregation proposed in one direction, and I appreciate that that's to do with the layout of the street and the widths of carriageways and footways, but if you just want to explain that, please.
Yes, that's correct. Because of the limited road space available, and due to the nature of the site being facilitating for industrial uses, high goods vehicles, there's a high percentage of high goods vehicles using that route. So the designers have recommended 3 meters to allow HGVs to pass. So obviously that's limited the space we have available. Based on side roads as well, and providing the link, the east side was more preferred because it would be more continuous than providing on the westbound approach.
And I think in terms of which direction, the proposed direction for the segregated route links more easily into the actual junction at Fulford Road, doesn't it? Whereas if it was on the other side.
Yes, so the eastbound is heading towards the Fulford Junction, the westbound is heading towards off-road footpath.
Yes, okay. And also one of the comments, I mean, a lot of very helpful comments in the responses. There was one comment about why we don't use the Dutch approach of, I think they were suggesting a 5 metre wide carriageway and then a 1.5 metre wide westbound lane. I don't know whether that was the sort of thing that had been considered at all. Is that just not an approach that is used in this particular context?
Is to do with the HGVs, the high goods vehicles,
Yeah.
the requirements of allowing them to pass each other safely.
Right. Okay. So I mean, obviously, it is a 20-mile-an-hour limit, but it would need to do that. Would need to. I recognise that some of those vehicles would need to pull into the cycle lane. If it was a separate cycle lane to pass each other at that point. Yeah.
And that would require narrowing footpaths even further.
Okay. The other point which was raised, well, there's a number of points in here apart from the funding issue. Just to clarify the impact on parking, it's slightly strange geography because Hospital Fields Road is used as the label for the east-west main road, but also the 3 sides of the bit around the industrial estate. But just to clarify, the traffic regulation order would only apply to the east-west road where we're proposing to put a cycle lane. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's currently what is proposed.
Yes, and it would be, it's already double yellow lines on one side. It would be restricting the parking on the opposite side of the road. That
correct
is the sort of proposal. Okay, just thought it's useful to be clear about that.
Obviously, that will form part of the traffic regulation order process, and based on the detailed design, those details will be ironed out in more detail. But at this moment, what's proposed is just no waiting restrictions.
Okay. And do we have any idea of what I appreciate that after today's decision, there'll be more detailed design work to be done and the traffic regulation order then to be advertised for that further stage. So when it comes back to a further decision, there'll be the outcome of that process. Is that, I got understood that correctly?
No, so one of the decisions we are asking for is to delegate authority to the director to approve the detailed design.
Okay.
So it doesn't need to come back to a decision session.
I think the only thing it would come back for is if there was objections to the traffic regulation or changes, potentially it would then need to come back. But the design, the report as proposed is that you delegate detailed design to myself to finalise.
All right. Okay. Well, I may look at that when I get to. I've got 1 or 2 other comments to make.
Just that is effectively what the vast majority of schemes that come in front of you do. We come to you for one decision at the preliminary stage for the principal, and then it's very rare that a scheme looks identical to what is presented to you. There is a decision made by officers to come back to you if we think that it's changed materially enough that a further decision is required. So I think this is just laying out more clearly what we normally do anyway.
Okay. So the proposed I think one factor obviously attention has been drawn to the budget for this was £800,000, and unusually in this field it seems as though all of the options are about up to half or just slightly over half of that cost. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, because obviously the money was allocated on the estimate that you gave us in the first place.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Just to explain why it's come in as half the cost that was originally estimated.
Yeah, with the cost obviously is prelim design, the costing is based on that. So there's certain other items which have not been included. So this is very high level costs. So it's not including for any stats versions that might be. I don't think stats is affected, but it's not taking it's very high level cost.
So basically you're saying this could change significantly depending on when you actually look at the detail on the road as to where the sewers and other things are. I can certainly tell you where some cables are because they're the smoothest part of the path of the cyclist.
It depends on what scheme we take forward and if there's any carriageway works that needs to be done.
Okay, thank you.
I think the reason it's in there is to reassure you that it's a deliverable scheme.
Okay. So do you want to just run through the 4 different options? I think that would be helpful because paragraph 94 does say that design 1 is 305,000, ranging up to design 3 is the most expensive at 482. So that's quite a significant difference in cost for the different options. So the different designs that you've got are shown on what's page 219, I think. And I've got my magnifying glass ready in case I need it. So presume page 219 is option 1, is it?
Just some other pros and cons.
Yeah, so in terms of the cost differences between design 1 being the cheapest solution to design 4 being the highest. So it's just obviously the cost of the works that's required for design 4 being more complicated than delivering a design 1. That's why you're getting a difference in cost, but it's the difference between them. It's not that big difference in terms of construction work costs. So I'll just run through the pros of each option. So with design 1, as I mentioned, is the most cost-effective solution. It provides a segregation for cyclists in the eastbound direction. And it received in the consultation they received positive. The type of infrastructure received positive comments from the consultation. In terms of the cons of the design option, is out of the four proposed schemes, this scored the lowest in terms of the cycle level of service assessment by LTN 120. It reduces the footpath to 1.5 meters, which is the minimum stated by DFT. Design 2 offers the pros offers a physical protection for cyclists traveling eastbound. Is a continuous link from the north, from the off-road path by the river up Hospital Fields Road. It offers a pedestrian priority at the side road junctions, so crossing. It receives a good cycle level service assessment based on LTN 120 audit score. The cons of this option is that it reduces the footpath to 1.4 meters at the pinch point, which is below DFT's minimum guidance.
So for what, I mean, is that's presumably at the narrowest point, is for a 50 or 100 meters?
Yeah, I think it's for a short section.
Okay. And was there, just on that point, was there any consideration given to whether, I mean, obviously given the geography of this, as you say, whether it's essential to have footways on both sides? I appreciate there's different businesses and things like that. Was that something
that was not considered?
Okay, thank you.
Just to add in here, I think you can see from these proposals, they're all very similar. They all involve a cycle route heading eastbound towards the junction, and the pros and cons of each of them are relatively similar as well. We've discussed the impact on parking. I think the other key consideration to take into account when making your decision is the impact on the footway widths. As my colleague has just highlighted to you, we have not put a recommendation within this report. All four of these proposals achieve the objectives of the scheme as has been previously identified. And yeah, I think it's a really close thing between each of those options.
Just again on option 1, there's a reference, I believe, somewhere in this very small print to, is it Rose Hill, some sort of segregation? I did try and have a look on the council system, and apparently thought I was looking at some dodgy sites when I tried to look at the design of that. But I assume that's some sort of wand attached to a curb, is it? Or
yes, just a curb. So it's a type of cycling curb. It says I think Rose Hill Cycle Defender or similar. So obviously it's preliminary, they've just put in just to help visualize.
I think one of the key aspects of these different options is that certainly one of the points that consultees made in response was that apart from option 1, the rest of them have no barrier other than a low curb to loading vehicles or people who are parking for however long they think is just a short period of time from blocking the actual cycle route. Am I right in that assessment that the other designs apart from option 1 just have some form of curb? It's a curb for a stepped track or a curb up to the shared pavement footpath and cycle route. Those are the other designs, aren't they?
Option 1 just like, so it's a curb on the carriageway.
Yes, it's on carriageway with a segregated curb, and I assume, as I say, I couldn't look at the detail, but I assume some form of vertical indicator as well to
That's not been
eliminate.
that's not
That
been
would be something in the detailed design.
correct. That's not been defined yet.
I think that would be certainly preference as we've got. I think the scheme that's implemented in Navigation Road has received positive response in terms of its visibility at, you know, all times of day and night and so on to road users. So rather than some random curb without any sort of markings to make it clear. Yeah, but you say that's a detailed design feature.
Yeah, that's the detailed design. That will be addressed in detailed design.
Okay, there may be some other points that I've got which you will refer to detailed design, but do you want to say anything about the other options apart from option one?
Like my colleague mentioned, the pros and cons are quite similar. The design 3 and design 4 both score well on the cycle level of service assessment.
So what was I assume it's the junctions is the main difference, isn't it? Because you've got the design of the junctions, you've got the bent in sort of arrangement with a raised table crossing on those, which is presumably what adds to the cost as well, changing the curb line and constructing the step track or
so design 3 and 4 they're very quite similar, and it's very one's footway level, one's different level altogether. So yeah, just about levels difference between design 3 and design 4.
I'm just looking at paragraph 100, the cycle level of service score. This design 1 is 78%, design 2, 3 and 4 are all 82%. So they're all quite close in that sense.
Yes.
Chair, there is quite a helpful table at para 93, which actually shows the difference in the pros and cons of the designs, if that would help your considerations.
Thanks. Yeah. I did look through all of that, but yeah, thank you for reminding me. So in terms of, do you want to say something about the design of the 2, 3 and 4 have that different junction design, don't they? With the 2 side roads in particular, which is access to the industrial estate.
Oh, sorry, what are you asking? What?
Sorry about the design in terms of the geometry, the layout of the path across the junctions, the mouth of the junctions. I'm just trying to sort of get a clear picture as to
the side roads
benefits or otherwise of the two.
Side roads appear to be the same. What particular feature are you?
Well, option 1 has on road 1.5 metre lane, which goes along the straight alignment of the east-west route. Options 2, 3 and 4 have a setup where the track is bent in away from a junction, and there's a raised table across the mouth of each of those 2 junctions. I mean, we are talking about 20 mile/h limit anyhow in this area.
So are you asking what the benefit of that particular arrangement is? Where you okay?
Is it not a consequence? Sorry, is it not a consequence though of the way the segregation works? So it's a consequence of curbs design versus, I mean, who come in, but.
Yeah, so with those ones, it provides a priority, pedestrian priority crossing at the side roads, and it's based on the level. So you're at that level, so it provides a link crossing across the side roads. Whereas the option 1 is on carriageway, so it will be at carriageway level. So based on the curbs, etc. based on design, it's easier to deliver.
So by choosing an option that has an elevated cycle path that allows you to use this design, which has advantages for of providing priority to pedestrians and cyclists crossing the side roads. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. So I think there's a couple of other points that I wanted to raise in relation to these designs that I think apply to all of them. So before we get to that particular point of the decision, the first of, I mean, you can tell me if this is a detailed design point, but it certainly would be my recommendation to be considered in that detailed design. The point at which the geography, right? The eastbound lane, when you approach Fulford Road Junction, the representation from the cycle campaign made specific reference to, I think it was from memory 6 collisions between cyclists and motorists at this junction. And as is done elsewhere in the city, I can think of Wigington Road and Haxby Road as one example. That cycle lane should lead through to the central position, not to the near side. That's where the conflict is arising from. So that cycle lane should actually lead straight into the middle of that advance box, because that's where majority of cyclists are heading, straight over that junction into the barracks. That's the whole point of this east-west route. So that needs to be looked at in the detailed design, and that therefore that any left turning traffic would be consciously crossing the cycle route at that point. But that may have some implications to the detailed design as you approach that junction, if you so to mean.
The comments will be taken on board for detailed design, and the design will undertake road safety audits. So
Okay.
it'll be part of a safety review. So if the designer feels there needs to be amendments, they can explore that.
Well, certainly that is my strong recommendation as a regular cyclist in the city. We need to reduce the conflicts and the accident statistics for that. Certainly back that up. But obviously they can be looked at. But my understanding from reading some of the representations we received was that cyclists feel that there's a lot of potential conflict with cyclists who are slow off the mark heading towards the barracks, with drivers who don't want to miss the phasing of the lights and turning left onto Fulford Road. So whatever we can do to make sure that cyclists get into that advanced stop line in the right position where they're heading, that's something we've got to do.
Can I just clarify the representations you're referring to here, please, councillor?
I couldn't remember exactly
These
where
are in the consultation responses itself.
Responses, yes,
Okay.
yes. And there was a specific reference in the response from the York Cycle campaign, in part, if you like, justifying their view that this scheme doesn't address the actual major concerns of this particular route. So obviously that's something I'd want to try and make sure we address. So that was the point there about, and it just to also note that the as we've done elsewhere in the city, there may be some differentiation within the advanced stop line to indicate positioning for cyclists going straight on, or as opposed to turning left. You want the ones who are going straight on to position themselves in the middle of that, not hugging the curb where they're going to get traffic turning left across them onto Fulford Road.
So the designers have done based on the project outline that was approved.
Mm-hmm.
So they've not explored changes to advanced stop lines. If that's something you would like us to look at,
I think that is necessary for this to progress, to be honest.
Could you just clarify again, sorry, what it is that you were asking us to explore?
this, whichever scheme it's on, it ends at the junction with Fulford Road. And at that point, the cyclists need to be moved into the central position on that advanced stop line so that they then the majority of movement is straight across, and that needs to be clear by their positioning to any cars that are following behind them.
So cyclists wanting to turn left don't have a.
Cyclists wanting to turn left would move over to the left of the box.
We'll certainly raise this with the designer during the detailed design. We can't promise that is how it will turn out, but we'll certainly discuss this with them.
And the other sort of precondition, if you like, for this going ahead, I think, is that some of the respondents have highlighted the shortcomings of the scope, which I agree, I accept was signed off, for going forward. But I think in the light of the representations and the accident statistics, which the cycle campaign have referred to, I mean, you may have some different accident statistics, they're not in the report, but on the basis of the information that I have, the funding which we have available, and clearly we have got some leeway in the funding for this project. Some of that has to go towards providing an advanced green cycle signal for eastbound movements onto this junction, because that would directly address the accidents data in terms of movement of vehicles emerging from Hospital Fields Road, conflicting with the cycle movements. Obviously, it presupposes that they are waiting in advance, but given the phasing of these lights, which I do know, living in this sort of, off Fulford Road, I regularly pass this way on my way walking into town. The phasing is quite a long period of time that waiting to emerge from Hospital Field Road, because of the priorities obviously to the main carriageway. So the likelihood is that majority of cyclists will be at the front of that when the lights change, waiting for the movement to take place, and any cars positioned behind them. So I would say that an advanced green cycle phase, and I appreciate that means more work to the signalised junction, which is originally outside the original scope, but I want to add that to the scope for this, so that you can put that forward as part of the design for this project.
Of course, you can make that decision. We have not considered an advanced green cycle symbol or any changes to the traffic signal junction as part of this work. If we do that, it would delay the scheme. We would have to come back for a further decision. It's likely to have impacts on congestion and costs and potentially other issues. But we can absolutely extend the scope, do some further work and come back for another decision if that is.
Unfortunately, in terms of our commitment to active travel, wherever we do it, we are going to have an impact on congestion. If we want to give priority to walking and cycling, then we have to make that decision. And I mean, I have, over the last probably 3 or 4 years, I've had correspondence with you about the phasing of these lights, and made clear that there are options which, for whatever reason, have not been taken forward. But, there are options that could cater for movement, east-west movement, for cyclists, not having to go through each of the phases as it's currently laid out. But I mean, that could be explored again as a further option, to ensure that cycle movements happen before the traffic movements happen.
We have no issue presenting schemes to you that have an impact on congestion. We have done that on numerous occasions in the past, but we have to make you aware of the pros and cons of each scheme so that you can make an informed decision. What you're asking us to do is implement something that we have not yet explored in terms of feasibility. We don't know what the impacts are. We will do that. We will happily do that. But if we're going to do that and implement it, we have to inform you of the impacts and for you to make an informed decision.
The impact will be 10 seconds additional delay to a busy road, but for the sake of cycle safety, I think it's worth an extra 10 seconds on the delay to provide that.
Just in terms of the decisions before us today then, so I think what I'm going to suggest is actually what we do is you approve B, just correct me if I'm wrong, the traffic regulation order, sorry, had to be made regardless of which scheme is progressed.
Yeah.
So I'm suggesting that you make a decision on B, defer the other decisions until we've done that additional design work that you're requesting.
I'm happy to approve the design.
Yeah, but we need to go away and do the work that you're asking for in terms of the advanced cycle box and in terms of the changes to the traffic signals. We need to go away and do that work to bring it back to you. So that's why I'm suggesting that what you actually do is approve B and then request the paper comes back addressing those points that you've requested. Because we can't go away and do detailed design with going back to some fundamental principles in this. So I think you can't almost pick a design without knowing the impacts of those, because one of these schemes may become a more attractive proposition once we look at all those options that you've asked us to go away and look at.
Well, I am minded to approve design option 1 on the basis that that is the only one that has segregation that prevents this route becoming blocked by loading vehicles. So obviously if there are other variations in the other designs that might address that, that could be looked at. But my preference would be option 1. Firstly, because it is on carriageway, so there's less likelihood of obstructions, drainage issues, it's lower cost. But also secondly, it allows a direct straight ahead movement on carriageway. I think there are some issues with that deflection which could be negative, but obviously if you're going to take it away to consider the other aspects, I think that for me the critical aspect is getting it right for this junction, given the accident record, which is referred to in the report. And those two factors are the advanced green light and the route that is indicated to get cyclists going eastbound into that advanced stop line.
If the issue that you are asking to be resolved is safety at the junction, I would suggest that we would need to do a piece of work that looks at the causes of safety issues at the junction and all of the potential solutions to resolving that. I think we're really jumping ahead here by saying there are safety issues. An advanced green symbol is the answer to that. We don't know that. There could be many other solutions to any safety issues that may or may not be present.
I'm happy to look at any other safety issues. I'm just saying I'm agreeing to the principle of progressing this scheme. We've designed one, but those aspects have got to be addressed in order to.
Okay, so you're saying your preference. So in terms of a decision,
yeah.
So you're approving recommendation B as it's written in the report.
Yeah.
I think what we're saying is you're not recommending the detailed design at this stage. What you're asking, not really making a decision on recommendation A. What you are doing though is saying that your preference is option A, but you want us to go away and do the work on the advanced stop line, the safety at the junction, and whether the green light is an option, but we'll look at that in the broadest sense in being able to give you you know, a balanced judgment by the professionals.
Okay.
Is that will be seeking? Have I paraphrased you correctly?
I think that's a fair summary. So yes, I'm approving further work on option 1 to address the junction design, safety at the Fulford Road junction. But obviously I appreciate that it may not come back to being my decision at some point in the future, but I would want to see that work done before the green light's given for this scheme to be constructed, basically, because it may well be that if for whatever reason that's not addressed, some of those who say other schemes should be prioritised needs to be reconsidered. So, obviously don't want work spent on checking where particular manholes and so on are if we can't resolve this issue first.
Robert, are you confident you've got that recorded?
So just as a quick conflict, in the actual recommendations,
So which page are we looking at?
So page 200.
Yeah.
So the first one is select a preliminary scheme.
Mm-hmm.
So
selecting the scheme, but not proceeding until we've resolved the other issues.
Don't make recommendation A.
Yeah.
Make recommendation B because they're required regardless of the schemes.
Mm-hmm.
Don't make decision C.
Yeah.
And then a new decision which says the executive member's preference is for design option A.
Yeah.
But has requested further work to look at the cycle advance stop junction box,
the safety of
and the signalling.
Well, the safety of the junction, signalling and safety of the junction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is that to be presented? Is that to be presented to executive, or could it be done in decision?
Fundamentally changing the scheme. All that. Well, but it'll come to a future decision session.
Yeah. We move on to item 6 then, residence parking. Thanks, the officers for that. Just to firstly say, I very much welcome the cross-party scrutiny input on this issue last November and the work that officers have put in since September 21, which is when the system went live, as well as input which has been so far secured from the user group that's established as one of the recommendations from scrutiny. I think paragraph 23 outlines the issues, actions and responses that were presented to scrutiny in November 22, along with recommendations which are given at paragraph 2, and progress on those comes in paragraph 25. So if you want to take me through the report.
Well, I think you pretty much summarised the report really to a certain extent. So obviously there was a scrutiny, the latest scrutiny on parking, which was within the recent past, which made a series of recommendations. They're contained within the report, and within paragraph 25 we give a detailed response to each of those. So I mean, I don't really want me to go through those in turn, but I think just to stress that the council's use of digital services to ensure that we use that where appropriate, but the resource we've got then supports those people who can't use digital forms of communication or self-service. So that's very much at the heart of what the council does. And I've heard from public speakers that some non-digital customers still struggle to access visitor paper permits. I think I can't remember, apologies, but I think it was a ward council who raised that. We're obviously joined by David Walker from the contact centre. That's not the message that we give to our staff in the contact centre. So any particular cases like that, I'm sure David and I would be pleased to understand where that messaging hasn't worked. Yeah, I mean, clearly it is an issue. We need to be aware of it, so we can look at that. I mean, we record all calls within the customer centre anyway, so when an issue arises, we can go back and listen and find out if there's been an issue and what the problem was, and try and rectify it if there's something wrong on our side. And then obviously, as you've referenced, we've set up the parking user group, and that's had its first meetings and has been useful in terms of that. And there's some extra work that we're going to ask that group to do in terms of testing a new version of the customer portal. So we'll that behind that new release of the customer parking portal is a lot of work around accessibility and making that work better for residents.
Do we have any date on when that might be?
Summer, I think, is as close as I'm prepared to commit to at this stage. But the idea is that parking user group will test that before it goes live, so that we can take any lessons learned and work with the supplier on making sure that is as accessible as possible. And we'll make sure that that user group as well also works through that customer journey for the paper permits. You know, we've just said that they're available to people who are non-digital, so we'll ask them to do some experience on that, some sort of, I think we've got to work through the detail, but look at that customer journey, some mystery shopping, something like that to work through how that works and see if there are any lessons learned for David's service or indeed for my service. And we'll bring those to a future decision session of this meeting. So I think it's been as with any IT system, it has its challenges, and as we've accepted, there have been challenges and issues. A lot of work has been put in by the teams, both suppliers and the officers, in trying to resolve individual complaints from members of the public, and I think that was recognised at the scrutiny meeting as well. So I think that probably covers the report.
David, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Not enormously. I just guess in terms of background, as I say, there's been some challenges while this scheme was brought in. So last year we had some 27,000 phone calls on the parking path, which was substantially higher than the previous years. But as we've moved into 22-23, and as we've tried to address a lot of the issues, that phone traffic has dropped off substantially. The end of February, we had about 19,000 calls, which is a reduction of about 8,000. So in reality, the number of customers actually contacting us about this has dropped off substantially. That doesn't mean that it works perfectly and people don't have challenges. But what it means is, generally speaking, there's less queries now coming through.
And how does that compare to the new system? I think it's probably the interesting thing.
Well, it is still slightly higher. I mean, if we go back as far as 15-16, which we do, we had 19,700 calls. At this point, we're at 19,500. So it's not that dissimilar to where we were 5 or 6 years ago. But overall, our demand around parking has dropped off substantially, because clearly, as we've moved to digital processes, we've dropped from sort of 37,000 transactions, customer transactions, to 21,000 this year. So the number of people either contacting us by phone or coming into the West Office, obviously, as we move to digital, has reduced demand, so it's reduced footfall into the customer centre as well.
And obviously, the extent of Res Park since 2015-16, you bear the bruises and the scars, has been significantly extended since then.
Yes, just out of interest, David, is given the visitor permit seems to be the main focus of concern, is that reflected in terms of the demand for customer support, or do you get significant numbers of wanting vehicle permits and other types of permits?
I don't think there's a disproportionate amount of requests around visitor permits. There's been the issue around the fact that, if the account holder isn't there, anybody else resident in the house can't get one and needs to apply. And I know that's been rectified in the latest scheme. But the queries generally are the sort of no different to what we've had in previous years. I mean, there's still some challenges occasionally around people accessing a scheme, but now we're a year beyond that. It's just the normal traffic. There's nothing specific that's arisen that staff have come back to us around.
And it's probably not your area, but I'm aware that this scheme, the upgrade, as the figures were asked for in terms of the cost that they were for the whole parking services, not just for residents parking, for a whole, penalty notice administration and so forth.
Yes, so the parking system we have runs everything. So it runs visitor vouchers, builders permits, it runs the handheld on the civil enforcement officers for them to issue tickets. So yes, the cost of the system covers everything for on-street parking, and it obviously this version of the portal has that self-serve element, which previous versions of the IT parking system didn't offer any self-serve to customers. And obviously a significant proportion of the transactions that are going through without any support. So as I alluded to right at the beginning, the focus is on providing a system that works for lots of customers, but making sure we support those who it doesn't work for.
I think just to add to that is something that we found, we've had some big, obviously digital systems put in, such as our revenue systems, so council tax and what we do find when we've looked at, and I can't comment on the parking system, is that a lot of the transactions are after 5 o'clock because people want to transact with the council when they're at home after work. Bringing in the digital systems has allowed that access, so you've basically got 24/7 access. So despite the teething issues with it, and I haven't looked at the parking, it actually provides a lot more accessibility for our residents outside of normal office hours.
Thank you. I appreciate as someone who was keen to see us move forward on this originally, that it didn't go quite as smoothly as was planned, but nevertheless, it sounds like we have worked through a lot of the issues and are trying to resolve more user-friendly approach. So I'm happy to approve the sort of responses that have been identified in the report. I don't know if there's anything particularly wanted to.
Sorry, no, if you're happy to approve those recommendations, then
The only one I did want to comment on was the recommendation 6 from the committee, which is obviously related to the visitor permits, and I think although we haven't got the sort of notes from the first user forum meeting, which I attended, they did make a number of helpful comments, as David alluded to, the situation of where a permit holder isn't the person who's at home when they need that sort of facility. So, I think there was some suggestions that which we can develop from that in terms of what goes into the new setup, which will address some of those problems. So I appreciate there is a delicate balance between promoting the online functionality, which a lot of people do find a bit of a benefit, particularly for many customers, as you say, who are not available during the daytime to ring up and ask for assistance, but at the same time not putting up barriers to a more practical approach where that is the most appropriate mechanism to meet an individual customer's needs. So I think that the suggestion here of taking advantage of the user forum, people are willing to help the council streamline the system and bring forward those improvements into the new version, which will be released in coming months, will certainly be very welcome. But speaking from personal experience now, as someone who actually lives in a residence parking area, which was my neighbour's choice rather than necessarily something I was keenly advocating for, but I do have personal experience of the visitors permit system, and I think we do need to take account of whether it's disability carers or unexpected household emergencies that people may find a paper facility is more attractive, but we want to we want to try and maximise the self-service element, and if it comes to it, allow people to have an emergency stock for some certain eventualities if we can't provide that. And it maybe there are digital versions that you can pre-book and then you just put in registration number or something near at the time, which you don't have to be the account holder to do that. But, you know, there's different options that we can look at, certainly. We take advantage of the comments from the user group in how we take that forward. So on that basis, I'm happy to approve the recommendation. I would say I now have just one item of urgent business, which relates to an item which was on my agenda last week, just an update on the proposed closure of Cotmanthorpe Railway Crossing, which was, as I say, was a decision that went through the decision session last week. Yesterday, I attended a very. Sorry, okay. Sorry, it's not needed for us. No, that's okay.
There's nothing confidential.
No. So I just it's not confidential. We're happy to just state this. This is it was a meeting I attended yesterday, organised by Cotmanthorpe Parish Council, with representatives of Network Rail, but also York Disability Rights Forum, York Cycle Campaign, York Civic Trust, the Ward Councillor and myself on the latest position regarding the proposed Transpennine route upgrade replacement of a current level crossing with what is a discriminatory stepped bridge. Network Rail have now lodged a Transport and Works Act application to close the crossing, divert the route via stepped bridge, and are given 42 days notice for objection. So that will now trigger the decision which was taken last week regarding formal objections, meaning a possible public inquiry and ultimately a decision from the Secretary of State. So just put that on record. That's where we're at with that particular item.
Yes, just to clarify, so the decision last time, basically you delegated the decision of which of those options I would implement to myself. Council have been instructed to support us on that in terms of preparing any objection to that and the strengths of our case as regards any objection. So we have already instructed Council to help us prepare that.
Okay. Obviously, it is any member of the public who is affected by that specifically, has the right to put in objections as well. We're statutory consultees, but other members of the public who live in Cotmanthorpe or anywhere else, Bishopthorpe or wherever, likewise have that opportunity. But I think it's 42 days from last Thursday, as I understand it. With that, I appreciate it's taken quite a long time to get through these items, but I think probably should put on record as the last decision session of this administration to thank the officers for their work bringing forward these papers. I think York is almost unique in having this level of engagement and openness in terms of policy decisions. So it's very much in evidence today by the representations we've had that the public do value this opportunity to comment on transport decisions. So thank everybody for their work, including the minutes, which are very important.